Look, what's going on here?
Who knows about this? What the hell's going on? What the hell gives here?
Are we under martial law?
What is this, another piece of information I forgot to pass on to you guys?
This is George A. Romero's The Crazies. Well, it's a version of it. This is the film told entirely from the point of view of a group of civilians on the run from the army. This cut runs for about 40 minutes, but there's actually very little exposition in it, so all we know is that there's a virus in the town and a mass quarantine underway. With a lack of information, this version of the film is actually a lot more tense and confusing than the original, because we're put in the exact position of these civilians. The film is actually made up of all these small stories, complete with different information and perspectives, so I've taken the film, put it in a video editor, and separated it into 11 different video tracks. Even just by looking at these tracks, you can see the way in which cutting back between perspectives is important for the film's structure as a whole. For example, at the start of the film, Romero quickly runs through 7 distinct perspectives. In the middle of the film, it moves towards longer scenes anchored in 1 or 2 perspectives, and in the conclusion, it returns to the fast cutting at the start. Whilst there are perspectives that only involve introducing or concluding the character arcs of individuals, the most interesting are the following 5. The Government Brains Trust, the Army Headquarters, the Army itself, the Band of Civilians, and Dr. Watts. Let's start by looking at the government scenes. There are only 3 of them, and they only amount to 5 minutes of the total runtime of the film, yet they convey a parallel narrative of the virus's outbreak. We still hear about the enormity of the atrocity, but we don't see any gore or blood or violence. We're cooped up in this one room with 3 men, and Romero uses a lot of tight framing on faces to reinforce that.
We say there was a live weapon on the plane, not destroyed when it went down. We've got a team working on it. If we have to push the button, we just say the weapon went off.
Now let's look at the film through the eyes of those cooped up in the Army Headquarters. Like the government scenes, here everything occurs in one space, and you can see that it's all shot within a doctor's office. If you only watch the scenes in the Army Headquarters, you'd get a sense of how the virus is progressing, but you wouldn't know information like the nuclear weapon hovering above them. These headquarters scenes are mostly used for exposition, and you can see in the timeline that almost all of them occur in the first half of the film. And though they deliver a lot of information, unlike the government scenes, here there actually is some violence.
Shit, Bucky! Every civilian, get in here! Get in here, soldier! Here!
If we point out those 2 scenes of violence on this track, you can see that they don't occur at the end. There's a big gap between them. Romero is not suggesting that violence increases over time for the Army Headquarters, but that them having so much information reduces it overall. This is clear if we look at the tracks with the most violence, the Army men and the civilians on the run.
What kind of virus is it?
I don't know. Well, the Army only tells us what they have to.
This is one of only 3 scenes in the film in which a low-ranking member of the Army has any substantial dialogue. Particularly in the first half of the film, almost all the Army scenes are just home invasions or shootings, which suggests something horrifying, that with a lack of information, violence is a necessity. The second half of the Army timeline gets a bit more interesting. Romero seems to be conjuring up images of the Vietnam War. You can see bodies burning, looting, a reenactment of the Kent State Massacre, and even the self-immolation of a religious figure.
In there!
Looking only at the civilian scenes shows us something interesting about information as well. Without any of the context from the Army Headquarters, these scenes are just people on the run, being chased, not knowing anything, and Romero clues us into this early.
We're in the middle of something and boys ain't playing games.
Even when isolated, these civilian scenes end up running for 40 minutes, so they tell a substantial story of their own, with or without the rest of the film. The story that they do tell, though, is kind of the Night of the Living Dead, Romero's earlier film. They're on the run from a virus that'll turn them into brainless people, and they're also on the run from a force that's trying to hunt them down and is growing in numbers. Only looking at Dr. Watts' scenes in the film is a little different. Not only does it give us a lot of information, but also tonally, it's more of a black comedy.
I'm a key man on the Crazies team. A key man! I'm one of the developers of the goddamn thing!
We can basically divvy up all of Dr. Watts' scenes into 2 groups. So first in the Army Headquarters, in which he delivers a lot of exposition and is pretty angry, and secondly in his private lab, in which he reacts to the Army headquarters and is also pretty angry.
I'm one of the only chances we have. I can't get back to a lab because you're not equipped to run a medical check, which we wouldn't need in the first place if I hadn't been backed off here.
Now look at the timeline, and you can see that after the halfway point, Dr. Watts is pretty much sidelined from the whole film. The only scenes he's in involve the introduction of the lab, a gag about the lab, and then finally his death.
Scientist, I'm with the team. I got a cure for Trixie here. Will you listen to me?
In his final scene, Dr. Watts is killed after finding a cure for Trixie. The Army mistake him for a crazy and he's pushed down the stairs. And interestingly, it seems almost to echo the fact that the structure of the film kept pushing him away and forgetting about him. Romero does the same thing for the civilian's perspective. You'd think that the film would end on its main characters, perhaps even this shot, after Dave and Judy face off against the Army. Romero actually ends it here, in a scene that actively comments on ignoring different points of view.
Human. Sooner or later.
I see no way out. Show me the way. I see there's never been a...
This final glance between Colonel Peckham and David is actually the only time their stories intersect in the whole film, and it's placed at the end, almost as an afterthought. This glance also seems to be Romero suggesting that each of these individual perspectives and stories never overlap because they're self-contained worlds, that us as a viewer are the only ones who get to see the full picture. The Crazies is actually a very cleverly structured and edited film, but the only way we can truly appreciate that is by popping the hood and seeing how it works underneath.